I said small changes can have an impact on the whole system. Obviously, big changes can have an impact on the whole system, but that it's emergent and we don't always know. So we talk about folks about like managing for risk and like the what ifs, but part of that is because we're dealing with something that's emergent. Complex problems defy easy answers. Like sometimes there's not an easy answer. Sometimes there's a straightforward next step, but the specific answer of how this is all going to go isn't easy. And I think sometimes that's why when people come to us and they say, I just need a transition plan. And I just need this to be easy because everything else in my life is so busy and I'm already trying to manage complexity on my farm business, on the agronomic and ecological side. I can't manage it on the social side too. The complex systems can be self-organizing. And so we have a bit of a process to move people through that I think covers some of these bases, like, more voices around the table, creating dialogue, communication, addressing, conflict or uncertainty. And there is uncertainty in complexity.
Welcome to the Farm Family Harmony podcast. I'm Elaine, Froese, Farm Family Coach, here with another episode full of transition tips, tactics, and sometimes hard truths to get harmony on your farm. Hi there, folks. Welcome to another episode of Farm Family Harmony podcast. And it's my pleasure today to have an amazing conversation with one of our coaching teammates, Lydia Carpenter. And Lydia has been, she's a lifelong learner, so she's been doing a lot of interesting exploration lately on complex and chaos theory. And we'd like to call this podcast, It Isn't Complicated, but it's complex. So Lydia, tell us a little bit about where you're coming from in this and your farm, and just so folks can get to know you better.
Yeah, so a little bit about my background, and some folks might already know a bit about that, but I've been running a farm business for over a decade. We started as first generation farmers, and previous to that, when I was in university, I studied and was very interested in climate science and meteorology. I did some graduate work in coastal fisheries in Brazil, and I'm fascinated by complexity and sort of like complex systems. And a lot of what we talk about, Elaine, and a lot of the themes that we cover with farm families relate back to some of the stuff that is explored within complexity theory. And so, making the differentiation between, like, it's not necessarily complicated, it's complex. And things that are complicated, putting a motor back together or like building an airplane, like it takes a certain amount of expertise and knowledge to be able to do that. And it's linear and there's a right way, like you don't necessarily want to be in an airplane that's not put together correctly. And so that is a complicated thing and I don't know how to do it. And so I'm relying on others. However, in complex systems, it's not always knowable. It's layered. It's not linear. And agriculture is a really perfect example of this. Some of the things I talked about, in my previous work in meteorology and weather and ecology, also complicated system or complex systems. And so in complex systems, you've got different pieces that are like interacting with each other, and they can shift how that system is working. And agriculture and food is a really great example when you think about having to interact with natural systems, economies, policy, but also the human aspect of that. And we work with farm families. And so when we talk about transition, I guess our message here is it's complex, it's not complicated. And so diving into those layers.
Right. And so I have my favorite little family rings here. The listeners can't see them, but they're little child rings that you would use for kids to play with or hang stuff from your stroller. But we always talk about transition being the change of labor, management, and ownership. And we also talk about the 3-circle model with families, right? That you have a family circle, management circle, and an ownership circle. So you and I were talking earlier, Lydia, we know that our listeners love checklists. And when they call us for coaching, they say, hey, can you just give me the checklist? And we go, whoa, you're a unique family in agriculture, and you have your own dynamic. So what are some of the things that you've found out recently when you've been doing your chaos theory course and in the complexity there that would apply to the work that we do with farm families?
Yeah. And so in complex systems, it's it's intrinsically difficult to model because, like you said, every family is different. People are working within different systems, different areas, different sectors. Um, we talk a lot about conflict, and conflict is sort of an emergent thing within a complex system as well, which is why we're not always giving people prescriptions for how to resolve things, but rather giving people tools. And so, in a recent course that I took, that was taught by Caitlin Froese and Chris Corrigan out of British Columbia, we kind of went through a list of, and I mean, you can read about these online. You can find other lists for complex systems, but these are some of the characteristics that we were talking about in the course that I took. And one is that we never have a complete picture. And so even for us as practitioners and like when we're working with folks, like story is really important because there's always things that are emergent. We can't know everything. And we have to, you often say, Elaine, like love does not read minds, but also it's not all knowable. We can just begin to have an appreciation for it. Small changes can impact the whole system.
Yes, and small changes can have a big impact, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's why as coaches, we'll often say, just keep taking the next step, because many people say when they come to us, I want to do this right the first time, or they'll say, we only have one chance to do this right. And I go, whoa, 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 don't be so hard and judgmental on yourself. And I like when you said about the complexity too, about we don't always know the whole picture. And that's why I think I like to use the word unfolding. So what else is on your list there too, in terms of the chaos theory?
So in complexity, I mean, we tell stories about what is happening, and we often ask folks, like, what's the story that you're telling yourself? And stories there's inner and then there's outer. So like there's the stories we tell ourselves, but then there's the stories that we hear from other people as well. And that obviously has an impact on the way that we see things. And story is really important to understand how people are perceiving and experiencing something. And so,
yeah, I just want to stop you on that line, perceiving. Also, Lydia, because we do the conflict dynamic profile, and one of the positive conflict behavior tools that we want to get people stronger in is their ability to perceive or put themselves in the other person's perspective. So the language here, I remember this young couple saying, oh man, it was so good to do this, Elaine, because now I can actually start to understand what my father-in-law might be going through at the age of 65. So I really like it. It's not complicated, it's complex. So one of the complexity is having a good internal perspective of what you're thinking is really going on, but also exploring the external stories and the perspectives of the other people around you on the farm team.
Right. And you need the diversity of dialogue to be able to make that happen. And I mean, we can talk about obviously, some tools that folks can use, but you need the space to be able to hear from others, to be able to listen, to be able to communicate, to have the opportunity to have that perspective. And so I think we are able to offer,
holding the space for that.
Yeah, well, and I think like we're able to offer holding the space for that, but ultimately people need to come to that space to be able to share and communicate so that they can put themselves into the other person's shoes. And you talk about this often, Elaine, that I think as farmers, like we're used to being able to fix things, and we want it's only what we desire to be complicated. If it was just complicated, we could just fix it. Like if we could learn it, we could fix it. And I think that within this as well, yeah, you can build skills and we can communicate. We can start to know things, but also appreciate that it's changing as things change. And so, I said small changes can have an impact on the whole system. Obviously, big changes can have an impact on the whole system, but that it's emergent and we don't always know. So we talk about folks about like managing for risk and like the what ifs, but part of that is because we're dealing with something that's emergent, not just on the production side, but also on the human side of things, like as people age and shift and, and family and depending on how people are.
So Lydia, how do you get the listeners to be more comfortable or more open to the fact that things are always changing?
Well, I think, yeah, it is emergent. Things are shifting. And I think one thing that can be really helpful is, story is important. So we often hear stories from folks, like they have a desire for support, and sometimes the stories are not great stories. And so it's like, how can we tell more stories that are helpful?
They're healing stories.
Healing stories.
Healing stories for agriculture. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I recently heard someone said, like, nobody plans to create more conflict. Nobody plans to create more hurt. And,
Hopefully.
right. Yes. And so that is an emergent phenomena that defies planning, that like things are shifting and changing and, tensions might escalate. But ultimately it's like, okay, what story do we want to tell? If it's emergent, it also means that we can make shifts and changes that move us in a direction that we want. So it's, it's not necessarily about specific goals. It's about creating new patterns. So, of course we're often advising folks like get your will up to date, and those are practical things that people can do. But they're also doing that with the best information they have available today, and that's emergent because things are changing over time. And so I would say deciding or creating space for dialogue, and then what do we want to see more of,
and building on what you
want. And it's not necessarily like how do we fix this now, but what do we want to see more of, and how do we move in that direction? Knowing that we can't know the whole picture, but we know what direction we want to go.
So I'm just putting myself in the shoes of a young farmer listening to this and saying, well, sounds interesting, Elaine and Lydia, but my father is standing here with his arms crossed in front of his chest saying, I'm too old. I can't do the technology. I can't make these decisions. I'm tired. I don't know what to do, so I'm just going to do nothing. And I guess that's what have you learned from this complex chaos theory, Lydia, about how to dissect? Like, so one of the first tools you gave us is this an internal dialogue, a story you're telling yourself, or is this an external dialogue that you're hearing outside from someone else on your farm team? So what do we do with people who are not going to see it as an emerging shift of small things making a big impact?
Well, okay, so I think that there's the perspective of the person who's telling you the story. So if we're asking for that, like we're in dialogue, and that's what we're hearing this person say. And so, I think awareness is critical, like obviously some self-awareness, but also for the, situational awareness of like what is going on. So suppose you are the young farmer, having some situational awareness about what your own feelings are, that is the story that you are receiving from that person. And you can't, my sense is like, rather than deciding you're not going to accept that story and push back on it,
you're going to work
trying to make sense of it. Yeah. So in complex systems, like sense making, particularly social systems, is really important. So like, how do you make sense of that story? And so you just mentioned like putting yourself in the other person's shoes. And so being in curiosity is really important here too. So it's like, why do they feel that way? What's going on for them? They've obviously run this farm for 30 years. They didn't, so why now? What's different? What's shifting? And so within complexity and within these stories, it's like getting to a finer level of detail and granularity. So do you can you put yourself in a place where you can expand on that story and hear more from that person initially? Actions obviously move you in a direction that you want to go. But the stories are going to inform some of that as well. So again, it's iterative and it's kind of, it's shifting and moving. And so creating space to make sense of that.
And I think you also said having the place to have a proper dialogue, not just walking shoulder to shoulder to the shop or the barn, and actually bringing people to the table. We talk about that a lot on our team, about how to get folks to the table. And I've had a couple of hard stories this week where there's been a lot of frustration of the next gen just not getting people to the table, not even getting the dialogue started. So what else have you learned on your list?
Well, when you're working in complexity, I think part of it is it requires like this work, farm transition, working in these, it requires dialogue and communication.
So that's the goal. That's the ultimate foundation, I feel. Because if you can't talk, you can't create solutions, you can't seek understanding, you're just going to throw up your hands and walk away from the table, and then things are just going to stay the same or get worse, because not making a decision for this complexity is actually making a decision. So where do you get strength to stay in the dialogue? Lydia? Like, is it a framing? Because I think you got really excited when you were sharing with me all the things you were learning in the chaos theory course about, and some people have told me, Elaine, being on this farm is like being in a conversation that never ends. So when does the chaos and the complexity start sorting itself to become more manageable to make decisions?
Well, and this, yeah, and part of it too is like there's inner systems and there's outer systems. Like if you, like you're all, a level of self-awareness is really important because if you're working in complexity, so not only like agriculture, food system, like from the outside looking in, because it'll look from the outside, there's like this is a complex system. There's all these moving parts. There's these things that we can't manage or we can't know it all. And then in the family,
Farmers manage a lot of complex things. That's what agriculture is.
that's right. And so you can sit back on the sidelines, so to speak, and we can sit here and look inward. But then also as farmers, as producers, as people in family farms, it's like looking, like doing the inner work or like looking at the inner system to say like, how much of this can I manage? How much inner chaos and inner complexity, like what is going on for me? So a degree of self-awareness is really important. And if you're trying to find, like create solutions within the system, then you need to know that other voices within that are going to be able to come to the table. And I think that one way of thinking about this is, that we're working at finer levels of granularity. So for us, when we do this work, you can apply it to your farm and you think of the farms, or you can apply it to ag policy or like bigger systems thing, and we can go more and we can go inward more. So you can go to the farm family, the individual household, the individual. And so I think deciding where you want to work or where it's possible. And then you're looking for patterns. And one thing that was, just thinking about like doing pattern work, like you can get stuck in patterns that aren't helpful, but it's also helpful to recognize that you're in one. So yeah, it was taking you.
I would refer people to the podcast that I also did with Patricia Morgan if they want to look that one up, because she's a counselor therapist. And we drilled down a lot on coming back to center and being and challenging unhelpful thinking patterns. So that obviously the way you think creates your behavior and your actions. And if you're not self-aware, like you're saying, and not knowing whether or not you're making good decisions or really asking for what you want, then your thinking patterns are not going to be helpful, right?
Well, yeah, I think so. If you are working in a complex system, you're working with patterns, and if you're trying to think about your farm and your family system, and you're trying to apply it there, maybe even using these examples and applying them elsewhere in your life first. So apply them to, like, if you like ecology, for example, try and apply this there to see if you can recognize the patterns, recognizing that action move us in a direction and not towards a goal. You start to work at finer levels of granularity. So you can go bigger, you can go smaller. Stories in human systems, stories are what make meaning. Because you think of in ecology, we're the ones who apply story. And so in our farm systems, we apply story. And so stories are meaning making. I think awareness is critical. So that piece you just talked about, like the self-awareness, and even self-awareness around power, around distinguishing us, and situational awareness. Like like meeting here or talking here, this is not going to work for me. What's going to work? Staying curious is really important. Because complex problems defy easy answers. Like sometimes there's not an easy answer. Sometimes there's a straightforward next step, but the specific answer of how this is all going to go isn't easy. And I think sometimes that's why when people come to us and they say, I just need a transition plan, and I just need this to be easy because everything else in my life is so busy, and I'm already trying to manage complexity on my farm business, on the agronomic and ecological side. I can't manage it on the social side too. And people don't specifically use those words, but I know that feeling, like there's already so much.
How did you have to walk this journey?
Exactly. Yeah. And a few more, just as far as working complex, a few more, like requiring dialogue and communication. We talked about that. More voices are required. I say more, a diversity of voices are required.
Also, I just want to stop you on the harmony and diversity of voices. Complexity from lawyers, complexity from accountants. And I guess I would shout out to the listeners here. If somebody is trying to explain something to you to create a solution for your transition plan and you don't understand it, be brave, be bold, be curious, and say, hey, That just went whoosh, way over my head. Can you show me some pictures? Can you write it down on a whiteboard or a piece of paper? Can you show me what you're trying to tell me in a different way? And I remember my accountant years ago explaining spousal trusts to me, and all she had to do was draw another box and say, Elaine, this just gives us another tax planning zone. This is the spousal trust box. And when she put it in a diagram, then it made more sense to me. And I know things like unanimous shareholders agreements too. They can be 30 some pages long, way, way high complexity. And so then you use the dialogue again and you say, okay, give me a 1-page agreement. What are the high level points here of what I'm actually agreeing to? Mm-hmm. So the shout out to the listeners right now is chaos and complexity are part of agricultural systems. We're part of how we want to build our team of advisors, but we don't have to stay feeling that it's complex. We can ask for them to dialogue with us in a different way.
Yeah, I mean, I think an acknowledgement that it is complex can be empowering, because then I think too, like, this is often why, unless people are coming with clear goals or a clear pattern or direction that they want, that prescriptive solutions can actually add to conflict, because there's a lot of different pieces in this system that feel unacknowledged or weren't necessarily explored, right? So
right.
Yeah.
So I just want to stop you for a second and describe prescriptive. So prescriptive is what happens when the parents drive to Winnipeg, meet with the accountant, they say, yeah, here's a succession plan. They give it to the parents. The parents drive back 3 hours to the farm, and the adult children are going, are you kidding me? We didn't even have any say in this. That's prescriptive. And that is not workable.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. Often if you are working in a complex system, sometimes the goal, it's this concept of obliquity, like the goal is sometimes best pursued indirectly. So we might say we want to transition, so we're just going to go to the accountant, they're going to write this up. But if there's conflict or tension or misunderstanding, the communication and conflict piece comes first, and it might feel in one way not directly tied to what you need to do to execute on the transition. And Elaine, I know that you're not an advocate for delaying, procrastinating, but sometimes it's an indirect way that you're going to come to the best resolution, because you're able to address some of the underlying tension or issues. And
Dan Sullivan has the strategic coach, and if you just Google Dan Sullivan, strategic coach, procrastination is wisdom. That's what he's agreeing with you, is that sometimes delaying is helpful because people have to process and unpack what they're conflicted about, and they have to talk more. Mm-hmm. At some point, decisions have to be made, Lydia.
Yeah. I think too, decisions do have to be made. And this is where it goes back to you're working in a direction. And so when it feels like, quote unquote, nothing is done, or it's procrastination, or like we're going to transition this in 3 years, and then 3 years later, it's going to be 3 years. Often it's, when I'm talking to folks, it's because there hasn't been a whole lot of action. And so you need to, in order to be able to work towards something, you have to be taking steps, so that it's iterative. It's not black and white. And so slowing, I often use this concept of like it's like slow down to go, like you go slow to go fast, but it's that you decide that what direction are you going in, and then your actions move you to a direction. So this idea, like the goal, let's say it's December, okay, so it's January 1st, 2025. This farm is going to be fully transitioned by January 1st, 2026, but no action has been taken yet. That can feel very overwhelming. And it's not even clear if that's possible, because it's not clear what the transition is going to look like. And so I think the encouragement is we're heading in a direction. What direction are you going in? And what's the next step you can take in the next 30 days to put you moving in that direction? Is it a conversation? Is it a meeting? Is it a visit with the accountant? Is it the financial planner? Is it a shift in production because what you're doing now might not work in the future? Like what is the trajectory?
Is it getting better cash flow? Is it getting better revenue?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that there can sometimes be some frustration when it's not clear, like if people are like people on a team are pulling the same direction, or if the two generations are working together to make this happen, or someone, someone's waiting. It's like, okay, we're waiting for the next gen to start, creating more revenue on this farm and do it. And next gen, like we're waiting for our founders to talk to the accountant and make a financial plan. But it's like, well, okay, what direction are you going in together? And then work in more detail, get more granular, and decide what are the next steps going to be. And then also at the same time being aware, like having a self-awareness about, okay, how am I impacting the process? What am I bringing to the table? Am I staying area?
I have a hard time. What am I having?
Yeah. Yeah. What am I having a hard time with?
I think that's what happens to the founders, Lydia, very often, excuse me, is they don't understand what they truly want. And so they put off as a couple, and especially as a couple, if the founders are disconnected, we say this all the time, then things really grind to a halt. So there's a lot of complexity that is keeping people stuck because they're not doing that internal work that you talked about, first of all. And then once they've done the internal work as a spouse, then they need to have the dialogue with their spouse. And then the next step is to have the dialogue with the next generation. Now that seems fairly straightforward to us because that's our process, is to make people think first about what their self-awareness is and what they want. What do they want as a couple? What does the family want? What do the farming team want? And what do the non-farm heirs expect? So you've just added a lot of different wheels and stories mixing all together. So how do you hold the space for that in a good fashion? Because we said before, it really always comes back to communication and dialogue and coming to the table.
Well, it's it's an emergent process.
It's emergent.
Yeah. And I think we can apply like even our work, like we can take complex systems theory and apply it to some of our work. And the complex systems can be self-organizing. And so we have a bit of a process to move people through that I think covers some of these bases, like, more voices around the table, creating dialogue, communication, addressing, conflict or uncertainty. And there is uncertainty in complexity. And, even our process is not terribly prescriptive in that, like, people might say, like, well, how long will this take? Or how do we get from point A to point B? And certainly there's no minimum requirement. It's like, it's kind of up to folks, like
how engaged do you want to be?
Yeah, how engaged do you want to be? And we've got different types of farm businesses, and we've got different types of structures. So sometimes we've got employees, sometimes we've just got family teams. And so I think it's about creating that dialogue and creating space for dialogue and not predetermining the outcome. So not
prejudging the outcome. Right.
Yeah, not prejudging the outcome. And really it's like the idea is like you're actually holding space for almost an appreciation that this is complex. And so the goal is to hear voices and to understand how people are making meaning, to encourage people to think about, to be more self-aware, to think about what they want, what they truly want, to understand that you're never like, you're not going to have a complete picture because things are emergent and things are changing. And so to be okay and comfortable with that. And so I think it can feel overwhelming that, okay, there's not going to be, like, you can go in a direction and you can have an idea, but you're not going to be able to predict everything that's going to happen.
Which is very hard for producers who are really, really detail-oriented and want to control as much as possible.
And I think that's where the challenge lies. And so where that degree of control needs to be maintained, as though things were maybe complicated, because this is what, like, yes, you can go to the shop and you can fix that thing and it's either it's broken or it's working, and you need to have a certain degree of knowledge. You can, you gotta you commit time to that and you fix it. Yeah, you figure it out. And I think,
or you ask your neighbors on social media, what do I do?
and my hope is that people are empowered when they hear this, that no, there's complexity here. You're not going to, it's not necessarily black and white. There's a lot of gray. There's the stories that we tell ourselves and the stories that we tell others, and the way that we approach this is important. And that you can work in a direction and you can shift patterns and you can start telling better stories.
And I just have this image of our head. You and I live not that far from a town in Manitoba called Froese.
Mm-hmm.
It's a swinging bridge. Now, when you walk across that swinging bridge, it has ropes in it, and it's not as, it's much more secure than it used to be in the old days. But when you walk across a bridge, you trust that that bridge is well constructed and that you are going to get to the other side. Mm-hmm. So that to me just seems to be a good metaphor for this conversation about, as you're going through this emerging process, as you're going through the chaos and the complexity, it's okay because you keep taking the next step. And if you want to get to the other side of the river, you want to get to the transition goal, you have to just keep taking the next step. And we have another podcast with Glenn Dodger, who's also on our team of coaches. And the podcast is around, how do you find out reasonable timelines for transition? And so you mentioned 2 years, and that is reasonable, 2 to 3 years. And so the complexity things that we've talked about today, Lydia, I hope the listeners feel that it's okay not to know, right? And we call it the neutral zone, which is the pain of not knowing. And so the question is, what needs to end? What needs to end is not sharing story. What needs to end is not talking. What needs to end is not coming together to share dialogue and communication and conflict resolution. And what needs to begin is being okay with not knowing, but continuing to seek knowing more and more as you do this emergent process that you're talking about.
Mm-hmm. And creating patterns of like creating patterns that work.
Healthy patterns.
Healthy patterns. Yeah. And that's the thing too. You can get stuck in patterns that aren't helpful, but then things around you are still changing. I think that's often why we talk about ages and stages, because there's certain things and even, I mean, within agriculture, you think about the markets shift. You go from a dry year to a wet year, your soils are changing. Right. There are shifts in the ecological system. There's shifts in the markets. There are shifts in the demographics of our rural communities. And those are things that maybe individually we don't feel like, I mean, in many cases, we don't necessarily have control over. And then there's our family business and the dynamics within the business that are also complex. And we might have patterns that we're kind of stuck in, and then the world around us is still changing. And so if you start to move in a direction, do those patterns shift a little bit? Do things change? And I think that's where, we talk a lot about being adaptive, and complex systems are adaptive. And I think there's a lot of, I think that, I mean, there's a lot of, it can be empowering to recognize that, this is complex.
Well, I hope that listeners also know that they're not alone, right?
Oh.
And you also, in your language, have used the word overwhelm.
Mm-hmm.
Many farmers in my audiences, when I'm speaking to them, they say, Elaine, I'm anxious and I'm overwhelmed. I don't know where to begin. So in wrapping this up, Lydia, just kind of three or four sentences or whatever you would say to your coaching clients. Lydia, I don't know where to begin. It's complicated and I'm feeling overwhelmed. You're going to tell them,
tell me your story.
Yes. Share a story.
Mm-hmm.
And then you also talked about internal awareness. And my question would be, what do you really want? What do you want for yourself? What do you want for yourself? What do you want as a couple? What do you want for your family? What do you want the outcome to look like 3 years from now for your farm business? Mm-hmm. And then I think another question is what do you need to, what patterns are not serving you well? Because you've talked a lot about emerging patterns and thinking patterns and that, the whole complexity thing is an adaptable process as well. Things are always changing. I'm just thinking of our crops this year. Like I think people have have had trouble with cutworms. They may have trouble with wireworms. They've had trouble with not enough heat units. They've had trouble with lots of rain. There's people listening to this who haven't had enough rain. And you just look at all the complexity a farmer deals with in production every year. It's never going to be the same, right? Mm-hmm. So let's transfer that awareness and that adaptability as producers and agrologists and agronomists in the crop world to what that looks like to helping have a healthy family dynamic. I think that's important. So thank you so much for sharing today, Lydia. I just love the fact that you're a lifelong learner and you have a learner mindset. I would hope that many of our listeners will join us again on this podcast. We have great guests who are really passionate about everyone listening to this podcast having more harmony through understanding as you go through this unfolding process to get the farm business to the next generation, whatever that looks like. And in your case, you're in a non-related venture with Ian, who's not even related to you, who I think is also interesting for folks to understand that the complexity in family can also grow into complexity, but also partnership with non-related parties, which makes life more certain and also gives you a way to move your business forward as well. So thanks so much for your time today. And folks, would remind you to share this on your social networks and with your friends. And if you don't have time to read books, you can listen to my audiobook, Building Your Farm Legacy, which you will find on Audible. So thanks for spending time with us today. Enjoy whatever season you're in. And remember, it's your farm, it's your family, and it's your choice. And we're here at farmfamilycoach.com to help you find that harmony through understanding. And today's episode is called, It Isn't Complicated, It's Complex. So just keep taking the next step. See you next time.